there was this huge part of me that I had basically tried to disconnect from for a very long time. And, the shadow is the part of us that we put everything that we don't like about ourselves, everything that we don't want other people to know about. And I really started to realize that that was a part of me that I hated. I had a lot of shame about him. He was screwing up my life. And so I had tried diligently to kill him off. What I learned through shadow work was that that's the part of us that we actually need to welcome back into the sort of inner kingdom of our being. As I started to look at those parts of me, my anger, my assertiveness that I had neglected and abandoned. When I started to welcome those parts back into my everyday conversation and admit that they were a part of me and give them access to be expressed in a healthy way, I started to feel much more aligned and congruent and just healthy.
Well, hello there, and welcome to this episode of The Terry Cole Show. I really hope you're going to love this conversation with Connor Beaton as much as I really did love having it with him. Connor is a book out called Men's Work, a practical guide to face your darkness and self sabotage and find freedom. And it's really for men. Don't worry, if you're a woman listening to this, which I know many of you are, there's a lot of insight that comes through Connor about men and the struggles, the self sabotaging struggles, the facing the shadow self struggles, the understanding your own behavior so that you can find freedom and show up the way you want in the world. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Connor. He's the founder of Man Talks, an international organization dedicated to the personal and professional growth of men. He's an entrepreneur, writer, keynote speaker, and facilitator dedicated to building better men. I appreciate that. His podcast, Man Talks, which I was on, features conversations with guests from the life purpose, psychology, business, and spirituality worlds. Connor has spoken to large corporate brands, nonprofit schools, international organizations such as the United Nations, Microsoft, Johnson & Johnson, Apple, TED, and entrepreneur organizations. He lives in New York. For more, you can visit Connor at connorbeaton.com. All this info will be in the show notes. But I really found this conversation fascinating and very uplifting, and I hope that you do too. I'm so excited to welcome my friend, my pal, my internet pal is more like it, Connor Beaton, to the Terry Cole Show. Connor, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Super duper excited about this that's coming out. So people can purchase this amazing book right now. Super exciting. Let's talk about all the things. There's so many things to talk about, like from just what you generally talk about. I'm so interested in, I was saying this at the top of the show when I was doing your introduction, your work I find super fascinating, interesting, and so needed because people are not doing men's work. Some are, but not in the accessible way that I feel like you are doing it, and especially with this book. So I just want to start with asking you your origin story. I mean, all of us hit some pain point, and that's the thing that you're suddenly like, oh, no. So what was your pain point? What got you here?
Yeah, well, I'll try and condense it down. There's the two big ones is, one, as a kid, I was a very sensitive young boy and I was very rambunctious. I had a lot of energy. I was a really, really wild boy. And I carried around what I didn't know at the time, but I carried around a lot of pain. I was a lot of fun to be around, I think, when I was a kid, but I was also pretty hurting. My parents separated when I was 3, and I didn't get to see my dad around anymore. I got to see him once or twice a month. And
Mm,
that really did something to me that, when I was a boy, I knew that something had really shifted in me. I could feel it. I could feel this sort of visceral pain and hollowness that I had suddenly been given. And I didn't know why, and I didn't know what it had come from. But fast forward later on in my life, I was living this from the outside, this great life. I had a cool career. I was traveling the world. I was performing. I had the motorcycle and the cars and the beautiful girlfriend. And if you met me on the outside, it would have looked like everything was great. And behind the scenes, it was just a trash basket, like I was just a disaster. And I was abusing substances. I was constantly unfaithful. I
mm,
was addicted to pornography. I was just a wreck, but nobody knew any of those things. And I had become very masterful at hiding everything that was going on, and the pain that I was actually in as a man. That didn't last. Obviously that can't be sustained.
Mhm.
And my girlfriend at the time found out that I had been unfaithful, and the relationship fell apart, and I was questioning my career, whether or not I wanted to be in that career, which I didn't. I transitioned out of it. But I had so much shame and at the same time sort of like pride that I didn't want to tell people what was going on. And so I moved all of my stuff into storage. I went and lived out of the back of my car for a few weeks
Wow.
before, I finally, for lack of a better term, sort of pulled my head out of my ass and realized that I was the problem, and that there was something going on inside of me that I didn't know how to deal with. And I had been running from it for a very long time. And so I started to look for some support, and I went and saw a therapist, and I saw a psychiatrist, and a man that had been in my life for a very long time. His name's Bernard. I talk about him in the book. He had been in my life in my previous career. Now I was a musician, and we had a few conversations, and he sort of took me underneath his wing, and he started to mentor me in Jungian psychology, in cognitive behavioral therapy, in Gestalt therapy, and Tibetan Buddhism, all these sort of like weird things that I had
Just
never been
amazing, though.
exposed to.
Like,
Yeah. and
awesome.
and that sort of put me on this trajectory of a 2.5 year apprenticeship with him, where I immersed myself in the studies of Buddhism and Zen traditions and psychological frameworks and modalities, specifically Jungian frameworks. And it really blew me open. And I sort of started to come out of that side, not knowing what I was going to do with this information or this knowledge or this shift, but it sort of planted seeds in my life that would mature later on. And so that was the big turning point. It was just this like complete rock bottom, complete dissolving of who I was and who Connor was and my ego. So that's that's sort of the long and the short of it.
I love it. I love it. We could have gone longer. So let's talk a little bit about, you talk in your work and in the book about shadow
Hmm.
work. I can't explain it, but I've been a psychotherapist for many years, right? So I'm obviously familiar with shadow work, but I really, really appreciate the way that you talk about it, because there's an accessibility with the way that you present everything. But I
Hmm.
love this because I feel like shadow work, it's got like a vibe where you're like, are we doing mushrooms? Like, what is happening with shadow work? Is this, are we in, where are we? Who's facilitating? What's going on? So, talk a little bit, if you would, about your own experience with sort of uncovering and dealing with your shadow, and then how you teach men in particular. I know it's men and women, your work, but you're predominantly doing the hard work with men, hence the name of the
Yeah.
book, Men's Work.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to just a little note about me. I like to beat people over the head with my titles, right? I run a company called Man Talks where I help men talk, and my book is called Men's Work, and it's a book for men from men. I mean, really, I think the book will give a lot of women insight into what's happening with men, but that's an aside. Okay, shadow work. I appreciate what you said, because I do really try and make it accessible and condense something that is conceptual into something real. And so for
Mhm.
me, when I started to learn about Jung and all of his frameworks and alchemical psychology and alchemy and all the different principles, the different archetypes and personas and yada, 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 the thing that really stood out to me was the shadow. Because what I started to realize was there was this huge part of me that I had basically tried to disconnect from for a very long time. And the shadow is, it's just in a simple way, is the part of us that we put everything that we don't like about ourselves, everything that we don't want other people to know about, and everything that we want to hide. And I really started to, at first, realize that that was a part of me that I hated. I fucking hated that part of me. I thought he was a
Mhm.
trash bag. I had a lot of shame about him. That part of me I really saw as being damaging and hurtful and angry. And, he was screwing up my life. And so I had tried diligently to kill him off,
Mhm.
essentially. I had really tried to get rid of him. And what I learned through shadow work was, and learning through just Jungian modalities, but was that that's the part of us that we actually need to welcome back into the sort of inner kingdom of our being, back into the home of our heart and our soul and our mind. And for me, what I started to realize that is that as I started to look at those parts of me, my anger, my assertiveness that I had neglected and abandoned, my sexual desires that I had hidden from relationships but would express in affairs. When I started to welcome those parts back into my everyday conversation and admit that they were there and admit that they were a part of me and give them access to be expressed in a healthy way, I started to notice that my life started to change very quickly, very rapidly, and things started to look very different than they did before. And I started to feel much more aligned and congruent and just healthy, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. I just felt healthier. That was my journey with the shadow, was seeing all of these different parts. I'll give another example. For a long time, I had disconnected from my anger because I grew up in an environment where I saw anger as being something that either wasn't expressed and it was suppressed, or it was something that was volatile and hostile, and it would lead to aggression and pain. It'd lead to me being verbally or emotionally or physically abused in some capacity.
Mhm.
And so I had tried diligently to disconnect from my anger and to never show people in my life when I was angry. And every once in a while it would pop out, and it would be really wild and volatile, and then it would just go away and I would hide from it. Because in all truth, I was afraid of my own anger. And I think this is the case for a lot of men, is that we walk around and we feel this, especially young men, this sort of very big, intense experience internally that we don't know how to deal with. And I just tried to hide that from the world. And so the more that I could start to say, I'm feeling angry right now, and here's what it feels like in my body. And here's, I can feel heat in my chest, and it feels like that Iron Man thing that's right in the middle. You've seen Iron Man, he's got that power center in the middle of his chest.
Mhm.
It's like, well, when I get angry, I can feel that part of me just start to light up. And so the more that I got attuned to what anger felt like somatically and physically in my body, the signs of what was causing me to feel angry, and more
Mhm.
importantly, when I was able to express that I was feeling that way without shame, without judgment, and without needing to sort of shut it down or run away from it, it would dissipate. And I started to realize that I could trust my anger and that it could trust me. And through doing that, started to build a kind of relationship with my anger. And in doing that, again, welcomed it back in to who I was, rather than it being sort of outside of the kingdom or the house of this is who Connor is. It's outside there, it's exiled, it's not allowed to be a part of my conversations, a part of my relationships, a part of
Mhm.
how I do business. It's not allowed to be present. Suddenly it was allowed to be present in my life again. And it was much easier for me to set boundaries, to communicate, to be honest with people about what I wanted and what I desired. And so it started to shift. So that, in a sort of very real way, is what quote unquote integration of the shadow sounds like, or a part of the shadow, because there are many different pieces that we can discard into the
Mhm.
shadow.
That's amazing. I love the story, and I love the trajectory of the story, being able to see the shifts in real life, your actual life, right? Currently, from being able to do that. And I was listening to an interview that you did a while ago, and you said what we integrate dissipates.
Mm,
And as we know, what you resist persists,
mhm,
especially with something like anger. And I think it's very common for men and women, depending on where you're raised and the culture, but certainly the family I grew up in with three older sisters, anger was what I would call a forbidden emotion.
mm,
And so it wasn't that I had any healthy models of behavior. It was literally like not allowed. And when you're a kid, like no one needs to like send you an inner office memo of like what's allowed. Like you just naturally get it. You're like, oh yeah, exploding right now would not be cool. But what ends up happening, and I see this with my therapy clients as well, is that there's an accumulation. So what you're saying is when I'm able to say, "Hey, I'm feeling angry right now," or I'm starting to feel angry, so I want to, take a minute. I want to think about this. Can we, put a pin in this till later, whatever. It's like you're, instead of letting it become the volcano, literally you are dissipating that pressure by honoring, by acknowledging. And there's something that is so powerful, because the damage that I see from a psychotherapeutic point of view of when we layer and layer and layer, sometimes you get to that volcanic place and you don't just torch the village. The damage that can be done when the anger has you rather than you managing and integrating the anger is can be really scary.
I like that distinction, of when the anger has you. And what's interesting about even the verbiage and the language that we use as human beings to describe that, one of the things that I talk about with men is, have you ever got to a place where you lost it, right? You just quote unquote lost it, because a lot of guys can give examples of that, maybe recently, whether they're in traffic or online and they say some shit that's unhelpful, or in a relationship. And I'll just pause and say, what did you lose? What did you actually lose in
Mm,
that moment? Right. And if you reflect on what you lost, it's that you lost consciousness. You
mm,
lost your conscious capacity to respond from a grounded, meaningful place. And you became unconscious in the sense that that anger, that aggression, that reactivity took hold of you and you became it. And you are now communicating from that aggression, from that reactivity, from that anger. And so that's not being in relationship with something. That's something needing to overpower you, right? That's something needing to overpower you in order to have a voice in your life. We need to be able to build relationships with these parts of us in order to, whether we like them or not, right? This is the
mhm.
challenge that many people face when they are dealing with anxiety or panic attacks. It's like, well, that doesn't feel good, right? So you telling me I got to have a relationship with my anxiety? That sucks. I don't want to do that, right? So, but it's the journey or the adventure that we have to be willing to go on in order to prove to ourselves that we can be in relationship with that part, in order for us to see it having value in our life,
Mhm,
and ultimately for us to individuate, to find a sense of wholeness and completion. And I think that for many men specifically, I'll just speak to men specifically for a moment, anger is often the gateway to the rest of their emotional body. So
mm,
if a man can really start to understand, how do I build a relationship with my anger, then there's a higher likelihood that he can move into having a relationship with his grief, having a relationship to his sadness, having a relationship to his own sense of sexual arousal within his body. And it's not the case for every single man, but a lot
mhm.
of men, there's something psychologically baked within us. And maybe it's part of masculine culture, or who knows? I don't really know, to be honest. But there's something baked within us that almost says, if you can build a relationship with your anger, that's the prerequisite to navigating the rest of your emotional territory.
Mm,
And because we want to almost like prove, can I be in relationship with this part, psychologically, because for a lot of guys it is intense. It's a very intense experience that can take them over. Grief we can hold down, sadness I can push that shit down, you know but anger, sometimes that's just very, very challenging. And so there is something almost rewarding and expansive that comes when a man learns how to be in relationship with that part of himself.
and it is a challenge too, because of
Yes.
how we're conditioned and how boys are conditioned to behave, to act, and the same thing with girls, but just differently. So I wanted to talk to you about, I'm super interested in the effect of porn
Hmm.
on men in particular. So, question, why men in their 20s and 30s, according to you, are having less sex, the neurological impact of pornography, and what it means for male female relationships. Shall we?
Yeah, we shall. It's a big one. Well, I want to preface that, in the book I cite some research. I wanted to make sure that when I was talking about pornography and dating and some of these things, that I wasn't going off of just personal experience, because I
Yeah.
think that we can, especially in the self-help and personal development industry, we can get lost within personal opinions. So I cite some research that has shown that men between the ages of 18 and 30 from 2010 to now are 3 times more likely to not be engaging in any kind of sexual intimacy, any kind, right? So it's roughly 27% of men between 18 and 30 will not be having any kind of sexual activity. That's a lot, right? And
That
it's
is a lot.
significantly more than women, right? Women are at like 14%, 12 to 14%. It's not a margin of more, it's a lot more.
Mhm.
So why is this happening? I mean, we can go down the rabbit hole of so many different things culturally and education wise. And I mean, there's so many different aspects of it. But in the book, I talk about pornography. And I talk about pornography because for me, it was a very damaging and very detrimental addiction. It really was an addiction. I say that because I was using it almost daily
Mhm.
for a number of years, and sometimes it was hours. and it
Mhm.
was something that I couldn't pull myself away from. And so
Right.
it really truly was your sort of traditional addiction where I think Gabor Mate says that addiction is giving up everything for one thing. I was giving up everything so that I could go and watch pornography. And
Mhm.
so for a lot of men, porn has become an escape mechanism. It's become a way for them to regulate their nervous system,
Mm.
regulate their body when they feel too stressed, too worked out, too overwhelmed, anxious, disconnected, lonely. I mean, you name it. It becomes the thing that we as men can turn to get a quick hit of feel good dopamine. That's what happens. So in the book, I talk about porn being what's called a supranormal experience, supranormal experience. And all that means is that your body experiences something above normal, right? More than normal. So if you think about, like through the holidays, through Thanksgiving and Christmas, you go have this big turkey meal, you eat more than you normally eat, right? It's just what most people do, right? It's just
Mhm.
you consume a whole bunch of food. That's a supra-normal experience. Okay. On its own, that's not really a problem, right? If you have a supernormal experience of eating dinner once in a while, no big deal. But if that becomes your habitual way of eating, that's going to cause a problem. And so for a lot of men that are consuming pornography on a regular basis, it is creating this feedback loop that they can get whatever they want, however they want, whenever they want.
Mm.
And that is a supernormal experience. It's not a normal experience.
Mhm.
And so you can go online and watch whatever you want with whoever you want. And it sort of creates this experience that as a man, you should be able to have whatever you want whenever you want. Okay. So that's
Mm.
part of it. From a neurological standpoint, what's really fascinating and interesting, and I'm going to explain one thing about the nervous system first that I talk about with all men because I think it's wildly important and I didn't include it in the book. So this is sort of like bonus. In order for a man to be aroused, in order for him to get an erection, he has to be in a more parasympathetic dominant state within his nervous system. So, all that means, the parasympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system is your rest and digest. It's what allows you to feel calm and easy and relaxed. And your sympathetic nervous system is your like the gas pedal, right? It's like the go,
Mhm.
get shit done. You're releasing cortisol and adrenaline, et cetera, et cetera. So in order for a man to become aroused and get erect, he has to be in that relaxed state. And the more relaxed he is, the easier it is for him to feel aroused. And then the more he gets close to climax, the more his nervous system moves into a sympathetic nervous system response, into a more stress oriented response. And when a man ejaculates and climaxes, the sort of dial turns into that sympathetic response, that stress response for a moment, and then all the way back to parasympathetic, all the way back. And so neurologically, what happens is that the brain, after ejaculation, after watching pornography, releases dopamine, so you feel
Mhm.
really good, releases oxytocin, so that's the pair bonding chemical. So now you're pair bonding to pornography. And
Mhm.
then finally, one of the interesting ones is that it releases prolactin. And prolactin has a very different response between men and women from a neurochemical standpoint. For men, it causes the sensation of relaxation. So it actually forces your body and your nervous system to quote unquote down regulate. So it forces your body into the state of like, I feel really good right now.
Mhm.
And it creates, like I said, that big supernormal experience. So what does this all mean? And this isn't me saying you shouldn't watch porn is bad. I think those types of conversations are generally not helpful. And I see a lot of men trying to engage with them online and it just never goes well and it doesn't help. But what does this mean for us as men and for us as men in our relationship? Well, first, it means that we are using something external in order to soothe our internal state, right? We're using something external to soothe our internal state. So I feel angry, I feel disconnected, and then I need something, just like I would, some people will reach for a drink if they're an
Mhm.
alcoholic or, smoke weed or whatever it is. And so we need something in order to feel relaxed and calm and satiated. That's one thing. What it can do within the context of partner acquisition, let's just call it, to be hyper
Mhm.
logical and and linear. What it does in terms of partner acquisition is that you reduce your capacity to want to engage in the sometimes very challenging act of finding a mate or a partner. right? Because it's not
Mhm.
easy, right? Social media, dating apps, going in person, approaching people, it can be very challenging, right? There's no risk in opening up a web browser, going to Pornhub, and typing in whatever the hell you want to watch. There's zero risk involved.
Mhm.
And so it creates this sort of illusion that getting a partner and finding somebody to be, whether it's just purely sexually intimate with or
Mhm.
to be romantically engaged with, should be this easy transition, should be this easy process and journey. So those are just a few things. I'm going to pause there because I said a whole bunch of stuff, and I want to just make room for you to reel it back in and maybe ask some other questions.
Well, so good and makes so much sense. I agree with you on the, vilifying doesn't help, but the the chronic, the compulsive use of porn to self-soothe has these, and I've seen it in my therapy practice as well, these far-reaching consequences. And then you have it's also unrealistic. So it's not just men can have what they want when they want it, or anyone for that matter.
Yeah.
Open, it's just it's at your fingertips, which meeting people and making meaningful connections requires effort beyond opening a laptop. But it also creates this very unnatural, like not normal experience of sex, because this is stuff that's written by someone, these scenarios that you're watching. And a lot of times, of course, it's fetish stuff, it's fantasy stuff.
Hmm.
But still, if a kid is raised on this, right, then you're like, well, shouldn't sex in real life be like this? Where's the third person? Isn't your friend coming? Because whenever I open my laptop, there's a threesome happening or whatever. So I've also seen this almost being disappointed with real life sexual encounters or interactions, or having no tolerance for the work that is required, right?
Yeah.
So have you seen that as well? Sort of like this, it's like this false representation of what it is.
Yeah, well, porn is entertainment. I mean, I've had conversations with people in the porn industry on this topic, and they all talk about the production of it, and they'll tell you like it's entertainment. It's there to entertain you. And so that's not intimacy. Intimacy isn't entertainment. It's real, genuine connection. What I've noticed is for a lot of men, and myself included, was that when I would want intimacy, when I would want sexual connection, it was just so much easier, even in my relationship, to just go watch pornography. And I think what's interesting is that in the past, when I was using pornography and I was sort of deep into it, would have a relationship and I would have an affair partner. I would have somebody that I really loved and I was close to, and then I would have women that I was sleeping with on the side. And so what porn sort of did was add to this notion that I could never get enough.
Mm,
There was never enough sex. There was never enough women. There was never enough pornography. I try and be as transparent as I can with this topic. It's not always easy because I think back to it and it's not exactly the most, I don't know what the word is here for this. I'm sort of blanking on it, but it's not exactly like the
right.
sexiest or sort of most empowering story. But I think back and it's like being a man sitting there watching pornography, having like 50 tabs open, watching a whole bunch of different subjects where you can get whatever you want
Hmm.
and to whatever you want it to look like,
Right.
starts to desensitize you. And so you start to have the perspective that sex should be this massive, huge, super normal experience where whatever it is, it's
Hmm.
more aggressive looking or it's sort of more fetish based or whatever the case may be. And a lot of the research shows that there's this correlation between the more porn you watch, the
Hmm.
more violent, aggressive, or sort of fringe you start to become, right?
In
So the
order to get
type of
off.
porn, yeah, in order to get
Yeah.
off. And so what ends up happening for a lot of men is they can sit there and watch pornography and really enjoy it, but then when it comes to sex, they have a much harder time staying erect, not orgasming so quickly,
Mhm.
because their bodies have become desensitized to the real life experience of sexual intercourse and interaction and sexual intimacy. And so once we start to remove that, what guys generally start to find is, oh, I actually have a much more clean and natural desire for my partner,
Mm.
and it's easier for me to feel aroused by them, and it's easier for me to engage with them and initiate with them, and to feel that flow. And so one last piece I just want to say about this is that when we use, as men, porn and masturbation to regulate the nervous system, to just sort of get a baseline sense of I feel okay, I feel safe in the world, etc., we will then use sex as the same thing. So we'll
Mhm.
become much more needy, right? Well, I need sex, right? I have to
Right.
have it. Why aren't we having it? And so a man will oftentimes become much more dependent on sexual interaction in his relationship and press that expectation onto his partner, because he'll say, well, you have to give me sex because I need this in order to feel okay,
Mm.
unaware of what's actually going on behind the
Right.
scenes, right? And again, this isn't to make any man wrong. I was there for like a decade, right? And so I had
Right.
to sort of wake up to the process that was going on underneath the surface and realize there was a much more meaningful, depth oriented, and genuine way to engage in sexual intimacy, however you want that to look, right? Whether that's with multiple people or you're into BDSM or like, I don't,
Sure.
no yuck in the yum, right? Whatever you're into.
Yep.
But to be able to explore that with another person requires a kind of risk. It's risky. And that's the enjoyable part of it. So, anyway, just wanted to put that out there.
I love it. So tell us, you guys, I'm talking to Connor Beaton, and he is the author of Men's Work, a practical guide to face your darkness and self-sabotage and find freedom. It is available right now. And Connor, I want to ask you, who is this book for? Who did you write this book for?
Oh boy. You know, somebody asked me this in the process of writing the book, like, who are you writing this book for? And I was like, I don't know. I was like, I'm kind of writing it for me. When I entered into this journey, I remember when I first went to therapy for the first time, and then I started to look for books that were out there, and there just weren't a lot that really
Mhm.
resonated with me. There weren't really a lot of books that were describing what the hell I was going through and what my life looked like and the challenges that I was facing. I've really written the book to be unapologetically for men, but it's written for the man who is entering into this work or has been in it for a long time, and
Mm.
maybe hasn't found himself out there in the quote unquote work, right? So it's for the guy that's just going to therapy for the first time, or is therapy or coaching curious. And then I think it's for women who are wanting to better understand the inner workings of a man's life, what it actually looks like to be a man who maybe is trying to figure his way out, in this work, and some of the obstacles and challenges that he might be facing.
So good. All right, Connor, I have one more question for you. I always ask this last question. Personally, what has been your most challenging boundary struggle, and how did you overcome it, if you have?
Most challenging boundary struggle. Oh boy, I'll be very real on this, as I'm sure most of your guests are. I don't know how old I was exactly. I can't quite pinpoint it, but my mom started to really struggle with alcohol. So I grew up with a parent who was an alcoholic and wouldn't identify that for a very long time. And as a young man, I became the classic save her kind of guy. And I, for a very long time, did everything that I could to try and get her to prioritize sobriety and, get her into AA meetings and get her to go to a rehab center and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the boundaries that has been one of the hardest things for me was to set the boundary of, I'm no longer going to try and save you. I'm no longer going to try and rescue you. And that shifted my relationship with her dramatically. When I started to step out of that role of being the savior son and step into the role of, I don't know any better than you do, and I see you struggling, our dynamic really, really started to shift. And that has been so important because sorry, one sec.
That's okay. It's so amazing. I have so much addiction in my family. It's ridiculous. So I
Yeah.
get it.
Yeah, it makes me emotional to think about it, but she's become quite ill in the last year, and
Mm,
so our relationship has deepened because of that, in many ways, because I'm not engaging in that anymore, and I can just return to the space of being her son and
yeah.
understand who she is and see her versus seeing her struggles that I need to try and rescue her from.
Yes,
So,
it's so
yeah.
objectifying. That's such a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing it. It's so meaningful to just know when you step out of that enabling place, even though you don't even know that's where you are, that you're really handing back that person's sovereignty to
Yes.
them because it is their life, and you can love them even if they're broken or even if they're addicted or even if they're whatever, but you can't fix them.
Yeah.
And that's really hard if you're the hero child, and that's really hard if you're the savior son, as you said.
Mhm.
You guys, this book is out on the 23rd, but you should order it today. It's called Men's Work, A Practical Guide to Face Your Darkness and Self-Sabotage and Find Freedom. The author is Connor Beaton. Connor, where can everyone find you?
Best place is Instagram at mantalks, and then you can go to mantalks.com, and the book is on there. It's mantalks.com/book.
Just keep,
Super
that
simple.
tracks.
Super
We're
simple.
just
Yep.
keeping the theme. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the work that you're doing in the world, my friend.
Thank you.